Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Well, I have been an old school fan of turn-based RPGs going back to Final Fantasy I and Dragon Warrior, and I've still enjoyed many of them over the years, so I thought now would be as good a time as any to share my top 5 turn-based RPGs of all time. Now, my tastes have narrowed and focused over the years. Of course, I started playing JRPGs like many people did, but I started to kind of lose interest in some of the elements that came along with JRPGs, and so my tastes really kind of shifted, narrowed, and I figured out what I really like about this genre. And so my list, I think, is going to include a lot of games that others would not put on their list, some that they've maybe never even heard of, but hopefully you will find it interesting. These games all have a strong dungeon focus, not necessarily exclusively on dungeons, but strong dungeon focus, fast-paced combat. That's not to say using the active time battle system, but I mean the rate at which you are making choices and hitting activate for those choices to play out it moves along at a nice clip. None of these games are brain-burny tactical games. They have also a strong and very strong, noteworthy, and serious aesthetic. Something about the visuals, the music, those things, that presentation is striking to me. And there's no bright and chipper anime art, which is very common in lots of turn-based RPGs. None of that in any of my selections. So yeah, there's some deep cuts here, some forgotten games, some hidden gems, except for one that's super popular. With each one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the combat, a little bit about the aesthetics, and then any moral or philosophical themes about each that jump out to me. Okay, starting with my number 5, Shadow Hearts Covenant. I played this on the PlayStation 2. It's one of those games that's lost to time right now, has not been brought forward through backwards compatibility or remastering in any way. It is the sequel to Shadow Hearts and caps off that duology of games. It takes the Judgment Ring combat and really kind of enriches it. If you're not familiar with the Judgment Ring, it's a disc that appears when you're selecting your action, and a little hand spins around the disc, and you need to hit X when it's in like a red pie-shaped zone in order for your combat, your strike, your spell, your item, whatever you're selecting as your action, for it to be effective. And depending where you strike inside that little slice, it might even be more effective. So there's a little bit of push your luck aspect to it. It's got a gothic fantasy horror visual aesthetic, but there is some invasion of anime-inspired silliness, just a little bit here and there. But the gameplay is so strong that it really overcomes that for me. I am really looking forward to news of its spiritual successor, Pennyblood, with some of the same developers involved in the creation of that game, but that's still a long way off. However, I'm really looking forward to it because, man, Shadow Hearts Covenant, what a great game. It's been too long to say much on the themes for this one. I just really don't remember, but I do recall that regret and loss is a through line, as the main character is living in regret of losing someone that he loved and was unable to save in the first game. Anyway, Shadow Hearts Covenant, fantastic stuff. Enough said for now. My number 4 is one you've probably heard of, and that's Darkest Dungeon, easily the most well-known game on my list. The combat has impactful, like one-frame animations that it just zooms in on with impactful sound effects and some lighting effects, and so that turn-based combat feels more fast and intense than any other turn-based game I've played. I don't feel and enjoy the loot progression to the same degree as other games on this list, or quite the same way I'd like, because it's more about getting resources to go back and upgrade your settlement, which will kind of have an overarching effect on the various characters in your parties that you take in. So it's not quite as directly affecting my immediate party members as I would like, but the progression and the sense of the progression is ever present as you're picking up loot and resources, as you're going through one more dungeon to get those resources that you need for that next upgrade you want that's going to help your overall goals. The Mike Mignola inspired art is inky, it's dark, it's got gross Lovecraftian horrors as enemies. It really runs neck and neck with my number 2 game on this list for enemy art design that I just love, and overall aesthetic art design that I love. It's also been updated with so many difficulty customization options. It was known, and I think it still is known, as this punishingly difficult turn-based dungeon crawl, but it really doesn't have to be that if you don't want it wanted to, even though that was the original intent, and I think the default way that it's intended to be played. But with the options that they added, it's a much more enjoyable, traditional turn-based RPG experience for me. The writing is heavily based on H.P. Lovecraft's work, so the themes are subtle and they're sort of subconscious, largely exploring the fear of death, the fear of sickness, the fear of the unknown, and all with a sort of gallows humor. Anyway, Darkest Dungeon, fantastic experience, very noteworthy game on my list. My number 3 is Deep Sky Derelicts Definitive Edition. I tried Darkest Dungeon because I wanted more like Deep Sky Derelicts Definitive Edition. And I tried Deep Sky Derelicts because I was looking into Darkest Dungeon and I wanted similar aesthetics and, snappy combat, but without that punishing gameplay that Darkest Dungeon had at launch. So Deep Sky Derelicts is structured like a roguelike dungeon crawler, but only in that you explore via a procedurally generated, almost abstract map. So you're not really seeing the insides, the walls of the derelicts and stuff on an overhead camera, overhead view. You're just kind of seeing an abstract representation of your characters going through the different rooms of the nodes of the dungeon, and then it takes you into the visual representation of the combat in a Final Fantasy style side view. The actions that you have available for each character are determined by customizable decks for each character that you draw from. Each character has his own deck, and the cards that you draw represent both action abilities and equipment that you gain. And as you're gaining loot, that comes in the form of cards that you then add to your deck as you take out other cards and stuff. You also have passive skill trees, so there's this great sense of loot and progression throughout the entire experience. There's a wide variety of character classes, each which with branching play styles. It really is a nice Just the Dungeons turn-based RPG experience. It's set in the gritty future of space, the rundown future of space. You are mercenaries hired to explore and scavenge, these long derelict, hulking space vessels that have been abandoned. They're now overrun by bizarre alien creatures. The art style is reminiscent of 80s graphic novels written by Frank Miller. Not that he did the art for, but the types of artists that worked with Frank Miller during that time. This game seems to be inspired by. And the musical score has a neo-80s synth vibe that I like, despite not normally enjoying the neo-80s musical trends. It's got that snappy, impactful animation, very similar to that one-frame animation, and is impactful right along with Darkest Dungeon. Maybe not quite as striking, but still really cool. And the combat is, always moving forward as fast as you're making choices, which again are light and keep combat moving fairly well while still having interesting choices to make. It plays with the popular 80s theme, and I suppose the theme that's had a resurgence in recent years of corrupt corporations and underdogs scratching to make a living as the rejects and the scum of society. You're striving for the happy ending of making enough money to live in a better place with a better status. So it's a fairly materialistic view of happiness and contentment that I think the writing is, I think, aware of and possibly presents almost jadedly. And the journals and things that you run into as you explore these derelicts also have a variety of thought-provoking philosophical content. So just a great all-around experience. That's Deep Sky Derelicts Definitive Edition. This one frequently goes on sale for less than $7 on both the Xbox and PlayStation stores. So if you like turn-based RPGs and dungeon crawls in particular, I would highly recommend keeping an eye out for Deep Sky Derelicts Definitive Edition. My number 2 game is Shadow Hearts. This is the original game in that franchise, my favorite JRPG of all time, without question. Even without playing Shadow Hearts Covenant, it's a complete experience. I am so bummed that these games are not playable on modern consoles through backwards compatibility or through remasters. This is why I want disc-based backwards compatibility, because cult favorite games or just odd personal favorites of mine that other people don't like, or licensed games that are tied up in rights and so they're hard to get remasters or re-releases done. These are reasons why I think disc-based backwards compatibility is so important. Hopefully we will be seeing some of that in the future, or retro consoles that can play older discs. Because man, Shadow Hearts right now is lost in the past, and that's a real shame. Again, it's got the Judgment Ring system. It introduces the Judgment Ring system. Other games have tried, including games that had one or more of the developers of Shadow Hearts involved in them, have tried to recreate or do something similar to this Judgment Ring system, and it's just never been replicated or reimagined in a way that's been near as impactful and exciting for me to engage with as in the Shadow Hearts games. Again, this game has Lovecraftian horror environments and enemies, bizarre enemies that are like upside down broken neck monsters. I mean, weird mutant babies. It's horrifying stuff. So very disturbing and Lovecraftian enemy designs, almost a complete dead serious tone, with none of that humor that started to creep in with the second game. Genuinely creepy atmospheres. Interesting but straightforward and fast-moving tactical choices. The soundtrack, I mean, it's some of that, I want to say, mid-2000s electronic style that was also bringing in kind of some Eastern sensibilities, really inspirational to me as I kind of did my own music creation for the Spirit Blade trilogy. So yeah, it's really, really great stuff. As far as the theme, you know, it's a JRPG cliche, but you fight quote-unquote God in the end. Not God as in Yahweh of the Bible, but something that's intended to evoke a traditional view or a biblically based view of God, I think. And I think when characters go up against God like that, it's a reflection, intended or not, of frustration and disappointment in life, that like things have gone bad. Who is responsible? Who is to blame? Surely God is to blame. And so we're angry at God and we want to take something out on God. And so there's this fantasy that we have in taking on the man in an ultimate way where we go after God himself. And so it's an interesting kind of thing. And yeah, there's a whole lot that can be said about that, but that's, I guess, all I'll say for now about Shadow Hearts. Wow, what an experience. And then finally, the number one game on this list for me is Elmire Original. I've talked about this a number of times in the podcast before. This game is a rough game, but it is such a meat and potatoes, just the dungeons experience. No wandering around town talking to NPCs and their cute little dialogue bubbles that pop up when you interact with them. None of that junk. I don't get lost knowing where to go in town and who I need to talk to advance the story. No, I go to town to resupply, and then I go back to the dungeon, and I keep going through the dungeon, and I clear it out. You make a sweep of the dungeon. When that dungeon's done, hey, then you get on the world map, you look, all the dungeons have a difficulty rating, you just go to the next dungeon that's the next difficolty rating up, and you rinse and repeat, and there's a wide variety of classes, huge enemy variety, maybe the most expansive enemy variety of any game on this list. It's got that satisfying checkbox fog clearing in the dungeon exploration experience. There's loot and upgrades that are very satisfying and meaningful. It's got a serious D&D aesthetic, which I think is just way too rare. A lot of creators seem to think that D&D is like, oh, everybody does D&D. No, everybody just keeps saying that everybody does D&D, or that D&D is too common and too generic and whatever. Everybody keeps saying that so much that it doesn't get made. It's not used as the inspiration for fantasy aesthetics near as often as I would like. We got plenty of like chipper, smiley, cutesy anime dungeon crawls of this type coming out of Japan, but very few that like have this D&D serious style aesthetic. Really appreciate it. I made a video going in depth about my love for this game, the mechanics, the rough things about it, and so you can check that out. There's no themes that stand out in the quote-unquote story. It's a pretty basic story, and also there's major translation issues that make the story all that more hard to follow when it does pop up now and then. But I discovered some of my own themes as I reflected on the gameplay experience, specifically some thoughts about satisfaction in work, trying to prepare for the unknowns in life, and anticipating exploration of creation in our resurrected bodies as believers. You can check out my video, Elmire Original and Dungeon Crawl Theology, for my thoughts on that. I'm actually going to try and put links below the video version of this content that you can follow to watch videos I've made for almost every game on this list. In fact, Shadow Hearts Covenant is the only one that doesn't have its own video, although it does get mentioned in one of my Shadow Hearts videos. So anyway, I hope you enjoy checking those out, and those are all of my thoughts for now. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.